A call for unity among French Muslims and a threat by the French and Belgian governments to close down what they call radical mosques. But are some mosques playing a role in radicalization? Or is the spread of ideas and recruitment online more to blame? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Darine Abougaida. Just days after the Paris attacks, in which 129 people were killed and hundreds more injured, there's been a broad agreement on the need for stronger security laws. That's the sentiment across Europe, particularly in France, Belgium and the United Kingdom. These laws would include powers to crack down on what some politicians describe as radical Muslim places of worship. But for many people living in Muslim communities, the focus on mosques is misplaced, especially in an age when ideas often widely spread online and on social media. Before we talk to our guests, Al Jazeera's Mohammed Jamjoom talks to a few Muslims in the Paris neighborhood of Saint-Denis about their experiences of growing up in France.
All his life, Sadiq has struggled with acceptance. Of French-Algerian background, he tells me he's never truly been allowed to assimilate.
It was always difficult at school. They called me the Arab, and it's always been hard to get a job with the face I have.
Born and raised in France, Sadiq certainly sees himself as French, but says his fellow countrymen and women only ever identified him as Algerian. Growing up feeling this marginalized, it was as easy for him to fall into dealing drugs as it was to slip into despair.
There was no other activity for us, not even a youth association. There are so many members of the North African community here who need help, but the city never has enough money to help them. They feel alone in the city.
In the wake of the horrific attacks in Paris, many Muslims in this city feel more alone than ever before. In neighborhoods like this, resentment is growing almost as fast as fear is spreading. Practically everyone we've spoken with today tell us they're worried that negative attitudes towards North Africans and Muslims throughout France will only harden. At the same time, they were all too afraid to tell us that on camera. Yasser Loueti, with the Collective Against Islamophobia in France, tells me it's easy to see why so many Muslims in France feel alienated.
From kindergarten, you are always treated differently. So these kids, provided they are weak enough, they will just slip into this complex thinking that this is not my country, these people hate me, and it's normal for me to be treated separately. So there are people who get, of course, tempted by violence, criminality, and there are, of course, definitely these groups who prey on these weak elements to turn them into homegrown terrorists.
Loueti adds that so long as the French government doesn't address the underlying causes of disenfranchisement and radicalization, the situation will not improve. It's a thought that haunts Sadiq. During his troubled adolescence, he dreamt of a day when things would finally improve, a day when he'd have a family of his own. Now, though, while happy to be employed and married, he finds himself far more concerned about his two children and the future they'll face than he ever was for himself. Mohammed Jamjoom, Al Jazeera, Paris.
Lots to discuss on today's Inside Story. Let's bring in our guests. In Mozambique, joining us on Skype is Johan Lehmann. He's president of FOIR, that's a center that works for integration of minorities in Mozambique. Over in London, Talha Ahmad, he's chair of the membership committee of the Muslim Council of Britain. And in Copenhagen, Jacob Sheikh, investigative reporter and specialist in radicalization. Welcome to all of you on Inside Story. Jacob, so it's unfortunate, the backlash against Muslims and Muslim communities that always happens as a result of the actions of a small minority. And now, as you're hearing, Belgian and French governments threatening to close what they're calling certain radical mosques. Is the focus on mosques misplaced?
Not necessarily. I mean, different European countries has each different we say challenges. And I just returned actually from Madrid for the local European summit amongst de-radicalization experts. And there we discussed the different approaches to de-radicalization. You could see in some countries, Great Britain, for instance, you have a very, very intense cooperation between the government and the local Muslim communities, the Imams, the mosques, and so on and so forth. Whereas in Denmark, for instance, where I'm situated, you've taken another approach. You've actually taken out a proposal in the recent legislation about de-radicalization that was about cooperating more intensively with mosques and imams. So you could say that in some European countries, it works to cooperate with the mosques and imams and local Muslim communities. In others, it might not, but there are
right now, we're not talking about cooperation. Right now, what I'm asking you is what the French and Belgian government possibly plan to do when they say they want to shut down what they call radical mosques. That's surely not cooperation.
Right. But shutting down mosques doesn't necessarily address the fact that there are thoughts in these mosques that could be expressed elsewhere. In Denmark and Belgium and other places, France, for instance, you've got very radical Salafi mosques, but the actual radicalization doesn't necessarily happen within the walls of the mosques. It maybe happen in the 90s, but it's definitely not so in 2015.
Interesting point that you bring up. Let's put that to Talha. Where does radicalization take place, in your opinion?
It takes place in many different places, but one thing we do know is that it doesn't take place in mosque or any established religious institutions. The lifestyle of some of the key leaders of Paris attack is widely reported in every single press you can think of. Most of them hardly ever attended any mosque. So the focus on mosque is misplaced. For me, the
so
whole
why is there a focus
on
mosques then? Why is there a focus on mosques not only now, but after every attack that happens?
Yeah, and that is a problem. I think the problem you have is that the focus instantly turned on the religion, Islam, and whether a section of the Muslims are feeding into it. And yet none of the evidence actually support that the terrorists are inspired by the faith. Yes, they claim that they do it in the name of faith, but often what we will see is that people who commit these acts very rarely have been very devout Muslims. So I think what we need to look at are the underlying issues. The underlying issues are this. In Iraq at the moment and Syria, you've got ISIL. And what ISIL essentially trying to do is portray themselves as vanguard of a certain kind of Islamic government that would earn them legitimacy, when in fact all they are is essentially a militant group, a criminal, brutal, militant terrorist organization which is interested in territorial gain. But in order to protect their territorial gain and in order to inflict maximum fear in the mind of those who could go up to them, what they do is they hide behind religion. They have nothing to do with religion. And so one of the things that we must do, and policymakers often get it wrong, is that we need to distinguish between pure criminal activities who are simply trying to tap into alienation that exists in the name of religion and deny them any space. When we target mosque, radical mosque or whatever that is, I think we do the opposite. We actually could make it easier for organizations such as ISIL to tap into the grievances that exist in many Muslim communities across Europe.
Well, it's not just Muslims in Europe who felt the backlash after the Paris attacks. Over in the U.S., for example, just hours after the attacks, there were reports of a shooting near a Connecticut mosque. And in the week since, mosques right across the United States have seen an increase in vandalism and threatening phone calls. Over in Canada, a man from Quebec is in jail after posting a video about his intention to kill one Arab a week. A mosque in Ontario was deliberately set on fire last week. Talha, just back to you for a moment, because you were talking about the responsibility of policymakers. But let me ask you what the responsibility is of imams, religious leaders, to come out and unite people and to make sure that the broader public understands that there is a vast difference between the radicalized Muslims that are joining ISIL and other Muslims.
Well, I think the response to that from us is very simple and straightforward. If you talk in the UK context, I personally know hundreds of imams and have seen hundreds of mosques. And all of them are actively engaged in their local communities, working with other faith organizations, working with other civil society organizations. And local communities know that the imams are doing their level best. On top of it, Muslim Council of Britain, for example, on Wednesday this week, we took a whole page advert in the Telegraph to position ourselves. So mainstream Muslim organizations and religious scholars have consistently condemned unequivocally and in a very prominent way to challenge it. But unfortunately, for some reason, again, what we see is that certain section of the media do not necessarily cover that. Muslims in UK, for example, they have ordinary aspirations like any other ordinary British citizens. They do not associate themselves with terrorism. And there is a tiny minority, Muslim community recognize that we need to do something about it. We are doing our level best. But what doesn't help is that policymakers, by constantly focusing on the whole community through the lens of security, that doesn't help. Just to give you a small example.
Right, go on.
Just to give you a small example, I mean, there is no evidence to suggest that any significant amount of terrorists are traveling with refugees. And it certainly isn't happening in the UK, certainly isn't happening in the US. And yet, what do we see? A blanket call to toughen it up for refugees to come.
Yeah, after the Paris attacks, there certainly has sparked really, some people say, very ugly debate on the status of refugees. But Johan, over to you in Molenbeek, in Brussels, because at least one politician where you are in Brussels says that recruitment and radicalization is happening online. What do you make of that, and what's being done to clamp down on online propaganda?
Well, let me first say that I recognize also for Brussels all things that my colleagues told, because we have similar phenomena here in Brussels. And I can only speak for Brussels Molenbeek, as I know it a bit. Only one thing, there is a problem somewhere with some preachers and some imams, and I should say the quality and the language used vis-à-vis the young people. There may be a problem. They are not speaking really the language that these young people really emotionally also touches it. And that's a part of the problem. But I agree completely that it is misplaced to think that it is the mosques that are really the institutions that stimulate young people to go to Syria. It's more to social media here in Brussels. That's what I see. And some preachers, some recruiters also in the streets. So
why do you think that the mosques are targeted by the politicians and the government and even people on the street, it seems?
I think it is ignorance. I think it is ignorance, and there's also a problem, I don't know in other countries, but that the mosques, that the imams had not really a strategy or a common strategy or a communication strategy vis-à-vis the authorities and vis-à-vis the population. And at the other side, it's true, there is clearly also some Islamophobia. But I think one should be strategic. Because one thing is, what can the mosques improve? And I should say you can improve the quality clearly of some preaching, the quality also in your contacting your people and the language you use, and the quality of your communication with authorities and with the media. Another thing is that there is something happening outside the mosques. For example, in our case here, you have some young people, and I absolutely don't want to generalize. There is a diversity among young people who are candidates to go to Syria. Some are really criminals.
Right.
Small criminals, or some are. And so there is a preaching, or there are contacts in some saloons, in some cafes, by people going to them and to recruit them, saying them, listen, you have to change your life, you are sinners, and if you go there, you do really, you change your life, you become a good Muslim, and so on. That's one thing. And then there are also young people, adolescents, and so on, who are looking for what is now the true Islam, because the Islam of their parents is not the Islam that they accept as being the true Islam. They see it as something cultural, something that is not really true Islam. And at that moment, and this is outside the mosques, there are some people that say, hey, look at YouTube, look to this savant, to these preachers, to these scholars. They will explain you what is true Islam. So
right.
There is a mechanism also recruitment to the social media.
That's the point that we were talking about earlier on. Jacob, what do you talk to us about the process of radicalization, because you specialize in that, and also I know you have first-hand experience with a childhood friend of yours, same upbringing, same background as you, who took a very different turn and joined ISIL in Syria. Tell us how that happened.
Well, with all due respect, I've been talking to quite a few Islamic State fighters, and we've been talking a lot about here, like about how to crack down on the recruitment and how the social media might play a role and might not play a role. But we haven't been talking about the appeal that the Islamic State actually has. That goes for my childhood friend, as you mentioned, but also for various other Islamic State fighters that come from Europe. The fact is that, as opposed to Al-Qaeda, for instance, who has been saying all along, no matter what you would do in the West, no matter how many troops you would deploy in Iraq and Afghanistan, we will still fly airplanes into your skyscrapers. We will still destruct something. We would be destructive. Then the nature of the Islamic State is completely different, at least according to these young men who travel abroad to fight. The appeal with the Islamic State is that it's, at least the perception of the Islamic State among its sympathizers, is that they're actually constructive. They're actually focused on building something up, building a state where people can actually live. And that is a very, very important point, because when you talk to these, these sympathizers who would go along to be Islamic State fighters, just as my own childhood friend, they would say, listen, we're not necessarily traveling to Syria and Iraq to kill other people, although that might happen along the way. We're actually devoted to the project of the Islamic State about establishing a state and sort of, materializing the revival of the new caliphate. And that is a very, very important...
So are you saying that there's a sense of a lack of belonging among those people that go join the Islamic State, and they find that belonging in ISIL?
Well, certainly. If you look at how people are recruited in the European countries, not only in Denmark, not only in France, not only in Belgium, what you can see is that there are various reasons as to why people choose to be recruited or choose to join the Islamic State. But one thing that is in common, or at least very often represented, is that these fighters have been experiencing some kind of social stigma within a short period of time leading up to the process of radicalization. So they've been excluded, you can say, from one brotherhood and seek to be sort of included in another brotherhood, that being, in this case, a religious brotherhood.
Talha, so having said that, how difficult is it to stop this process of radicalization?
I think the first thing that needs to happen is that we need to go back to the drawing board. For too long, I think the policies within the establishment has been dominated by a conveyor belt theory, an approach that is driven more by a naive ideological belief which sees Islam as a problem, as opposed to an evidence-based approach. Because without addressing the societal causes that creates alienation within communities, that creates a sense of despair, without addressing them, I don't think we're going to build stronger communities. And without building stronger communities, we will not succeed in that battle. So in doing so, what do we need to do? The Muslim community, for example, in the UK, we recognize that we have a role to play, a very important role to play. And we at the Muslim Council of Britain are actually in the process of a national dialogue. We had our first conference last week. We're in the process of a national dialogue in which we will come up with a set of recommendations with specific actions as to what the community will do. Similarly, the wider establishment needs to do its role. And first and foremost, I think government needs to engage open-heartedly and freely with the Muslim communities and other communities. At the moment, with the rise of far-right across Europe, what we have seen is that government has been too willing to appease the fears of the right-wing sections of the society. And we need to make sure that we do not do that. Because by doing that, we're only going to feed into the narrative that the terrorist wants us to believe, which is that there is a lack of compatibility between Muslims and the wider Western societies. And that is absolutely not true. And we must make sure through our acts that we do not give any legitimacy to that claim.
Johan, would you like to weigh in on this and specifically what Talha was saying about the role of society and communities? I know you've just recently written an article specifically on Molenbeek, where that district, in fact, is home to two of the people that were involved in the Paris attacks.
When I looked to Molenbeek, I started working in Molenbeek in '81, okay, as a social worker and as a university professor. Well, okay. And what I saw that already at that moment there was a huge unemployment, and there was a problem with the relation between school and labor market. Okay, now at that moment already there was a lot of unemployment, and there was, for example, also a lot of drug dealing and informal economy, let us say. When at that moment I asked I am speaking of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, when I asked to some of these young people, but what will you do in the future? Oh, they said, oh, we will marry, we will have children, and the problem will be solved. You will see it. Now, that's a typical answer that you will not hear nowadays. Nowadays, if you ask to such young guys, what will you do later? They will not say, I will marry and you will see, because they have seen too many people already around them that even if they studied, even if they had a qualification, a diploma, they didn't find a job. So and that's a problem, they feel declassified. They feel as if they are second-hand citizens. That's really a problem. Even if Molenbeek is not a ghetto, believe me, it is not a ghetto. It is subjectively seen by them, and it is lived as a ghetto. And it is true that by the outsiders, it is also seen as a ghetto. Now, in such a situation, you are looking for heroes as an adolescent. You are looking to identify, and let me shortly, they find the wrong heroes. They don't have Che Guevara or other people as heroes, but they have an idea, and when we look at YouTube, and when we look at what is happening in Sham, we see only beheadings, and we see this kind of things. When they are looking, they see a nice society. They see a society with a good Sharia, where they will have a good life, and they see heroes there who really take their responsibility, people coming from here also, and who made it there.
Well, speaking of that, Johan, let me just bring in Jacob for 1 second here. We're talking about Syria now, and obviously the reach of ISIL and the ability of ISIL to recruit all these fighters. What do you make of that when you especially look at what's happened in the past month alone? The Paris attacks, the Beirut bombings, the Metrojet, the Russian airliner over the Sinai that was bombed.
Well, it's hard to say right now because there are still a lot of missing parts with regards to the recent attacks. What we can say, and I want to follow up on what Johan just said, when we look at the profile of these men, and we need to do so in order to see how we can stop the recruitment. When we look at the profile, you would not necessarily see people that would lack resources just in Molenbeek. It might be true for Molenbeek, it might not be for other areas. We actually also do see, I should call it, resourceful people, average middle-class kids born and raised in the Danish society, in the French society, Belgium society, what it might be, seamlessly navigating through their society, being formed and shaped by democratic institutions. And the reason why I say this is that when we're talking about the profiling in order to try to find a counter strategy in order to crack down on the recruitment, we need to take different approaches. It's not enough to say, well, these people are just socially marginalized, just as I said myself in the beginning. There are also other elements to this. And in order to address the frustrations in these for these people who actually do not lack resources, but actually has a sincere devotion, sincere frustration in what they do see as a political instability and unfairness, we need to give them opportunity to address these frustrations. Not only to say, listen up, dude, you can't enter that mosque, or you can't have these, this mindset. That is a very important point.
Okay, thanks to all my guests for joining us, Johan Lehman, Talha Ahmad, and Jacob Sheikh. And thank you for watching. As always, you can leave your comments on the program's page of our website. That's aljazeera.com. You can also post your views on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also tweet us at AJ Inside Story. From myself, the whole team here in Doha, bye-bye for now.